Well, now that we got the technical questions settled, we're going to go with the bright lights, although these lights here certainly make it more romantic. So maybe after the lecture we'll turn the lights down low and you can stick around and have some coffee and chat and get romantic or whatever. But in the meantime, we'll keep the bright lights on. The Benevolent Irish Society has been sponsoring these lectures for nigh on to 20 years. And by the way, my name is George O'Connor, for those of you who don't know me. And I see a lot of familiar faces here in the audience tonight, but I also see a lot of new faces, and that's great because you like to always, you want to hang on to the old folks, but you want to get some new folks in as well, so that's just great. But the Society has been sponsoring these for 20 years, and obviously without the support of the Benevolent Irish Society, you wouldn't have this lecture series. So to start off the series this year, I'm going to call upon the President to say a few words, and please make him welcome, President David Corrigan.
Thank you, George. I'm not going to say a whole lot, but I have to read it from the paper because otherwise I'll forget what I'm supposed to say. Good evening and welcome to the Benevolent Irish Society Irish Heritage Lecture Series. I know if you've looked at the list of presenters, you'll agree with me that it looks like a very interesting group of speakers and very interesting topics. Beginning, of course, tonight with Dr. Brendan O'Grady and Celtic Christianity. A couple more that particularly catch my eye are Donnie Doyle on the folk song tradition of Lot 7, but I guess of the folk song tradition in general also, and Jill Harris and her talk on Turlock O'Carolan, harper and composer. As George said, we're very pleased to be presenting this series. And I'd like to thank the speakers for the time and effort they put into researching their talks and then sharing the results with us. I hope you enjoyed the lecture tonight, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the series. I hope you'll be back for more. It's really encouraging to see such a good turnout tonight. A special thanks to George and Linda O'Connor, without whose hard work this series wouldn't happen. I'm going to turn you back over to George now, and please join me in thanking him with hand. Thank you.
If you bear with me for another minute or so before I introduce our guest speaker for tonight, I want to put these concerts in a bit of context. We started these lectures because there wasn't much being done out in the community, either in a formal sense through our school system, which is unfortunate but true, in terms of telling us about ourselves. And when I speak about ourselves, I'm talking about the Irish and the Scots and the other Celts, who together make up, the majority of people on the island. and yet this is my political statement, folks. I'm trying to get you all angry up and get you going after your MLAs. But in our formal school system, at no level do you really hear our history, our heritage, our culture taught, and that's a shame. And that's what the Benevolent Irish Society about 20 years ago, in its own small way, wanted to do something about, and started these lecture series. And over the last almost 20 years, there's been something like 150 lectures given on the Celtic culture, the Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and other Celtic peoples of PEI. So I wanted to let you know that's what we're trying to do. And the other thing I wanted to do to put this series in context is to tell you that every year there are, as I like to say, 3 bases that we try to hit in the course of our lecture series. We like to present lectures on the island Irish community, certainly. So some of the lectures are going to deal specifically with the island Irish community. We like to present lectures on the old country itself, Ireland, and so clearly you're going to get at least one, usually more, lectures relating to the ancestral homeland, Ireland itself. And the third base that we always want to hit is to present a lecture or lectures dealing with the broader Celtic community, so that we would present lectures, which I would put tonight's lecture in that category, lectures that would be of interest to all the Celtic peoples, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, the Bretons. The few Manxmen who might be around are also Celtic and also fit in that category. So I think if you look at our lineup for this year's series, you'll find that we have touched those 3 bases, and hopefully we'll continue to do so in the years to come. So I just wanted to put that in context, the series in context, particularly for the new folks here tonight. And now I have the pleasant duty to introduce the guest speaker for tonight, Dr. Brendan O'Grady, who traditionally leads off these series. I think every year since we started, Dr. O'Grady has led off. And he does at least one lecture and often a couple of lectures in the course of the series. So he's no stranger, again, to the people who are regulars at the series. Dr. O'Grady, I mean, if you don't know him, are you from the island? Probably not, but we owe so much to Dr. O'Grady. Those of you who's taken his courses through the year, his English courses at St. Dunstan's and then UPEI, and of course his lectures in the community, which usually have some kind of an Irish twist to them or a Celtic twist to them. And he culminated, in my view, his work on behalf of the Irish community with his recently published book on the Irish community of PEI, Exiles and Islanders. So if you haven't got a copy of that, buy it or get someone to buy it for you for Christmas or something. It's an excellent read. I'm not going to take up any more time because I said most of you already know Dr. O'Grady. And I'm just going to say welcome to you, welcome to our guest speaker tonight, and give a hand to Dr. Brendan O'Grady.
Well, despite the fact that you already know me, you showed up. George, I have to start where I usually finish, by thanking you and President Dave, not only for inviting me once more to lead the series, but also because during the past year, through the auspices of Dave and George, I was voted an honorary member of the Benevolent Irish Society. So I thank you. So at last I can address many of you as brothers and sisters. I resisted joining the society for many years, but I could not resist any longer, and I was invited to be an honorary member. One of the interests that I've had recently, past 3 or 4 years, I guess, is Celtic Christianity. Actually, it goes back much earlier than that, but the past 4 years, I'd say, I've been reading up on it. It came to a head recently, within the past year, when a friend gave me a book called Celtic Christianity, and by Father Joyce, Timothy Joyce, Benedictine father down in Massachusetts. And I read this and found that so many of the loose ends that I had been discovering on my own over the years were brought together in this book, so that this could be a kind of culmination of one's study of Celtic Christianity. In one sense, it could be a culmination. Better still, it would be an excellent introduction. And so I recommend this book to any of you who acquire an interest tonight in the Celtic ancestors of most of us here, the people from Ireland and Scotland. I think it's best to explain, because George did point out that the Celts include, using the modern nationalities, include not only the Irish, but the Scots and the Welsh, the Manx, and all people from Brittany and Cornwall. But I'm going to concentrate on the Irish contribution. And the reason for that is that this is the nation that was least affected by the Roman expansion. The Romans never invaded Ireland. England had been a Celtic, what is now England, had been a Celtic nation, but was overrun, you see, by the Romans and by the Angles and the Saxons and so on. They got a mix. Whereas Ireland tended to remain a little purer as far as Celticism is concerned than those other nations. Okay? And I say that with due respect to our Scottish friends who are here. I think that would require a separate kind of presentation, just dealing with the Celtic people of Scotland or any of those other areas. When we talk about the Celts, though, we're not talking about nationalities, because there weren't any nations, not the European nations that we know today. They didn't exist. The people, the land was there, and there were people there, but they weren't designated as they are today as France and Belgium and Netherlands and so on. See? So the Celtic people came from the north of the Alps all the way up to the Bering Sea, and they were spread all over that area in what later became the European nations. But the first civilization north of the Alps was the Celtic civilization, and it was very extensive. It ranged all the way to Galatia in the east. The people that were addressed by St. Paul as the Galatians. They were originally a Celtic people, and that's why the Irish, when they've had a few drinks, when don't they? But when they have a few drinks, talk about the St. Paul's letter to them, because they speak as though they are the direct descendants. I don't think they were, but the makeup of the people of Ireland is very complex too, and we Irish people tend to think of ourselves as being, we even say a race, we're not a race at all, but a race, not only that, but a pure race, as though there's no mixture, we're Irish, period, back generation, but that's not the fact. God didn't start the world in Ireland. he didn't, even though a little bit of heaven fell from out the sky one day, and so many of our, if we could trace back to North Africa and the movement out of North Africa through Spain and Italy and so on, and across, then we would have some idea of where many of the earliest Irish came from, and that is the people whose descendants were known as the Irish. Now, but my subject isn't that. It's Celtic Christianity, and I'd like to talk about the Christian aspects of these people who came to Ireland, who grew up there, who established a civilization of their own that is still terribly undervalued, underrated by historians and scholars and universities and so on. It has been pointed out to me, even within the past week, that even though we in Prince Edward Island are living in the most Celtic province in the country, we don't have courses in Celtic history or literature at the University of Prince Edward Island. That's interesting. You have to go to St. Mary's or St. X or someplace like that to study the Celtic history. Anyhow, to go back to the question of Christianity, it was the faith of the people that unified Ireland. That was the one thing they had in common, the Christian faith. And sectarianism is the thing that divides them. It's interesting, isn't it? That it's religion that, on the one hand, made this unified people, remarkable people, and the abuse of religion, the sectarian division of Christianity, has led to such sorrow and bloodshed. It is said, maybe it's an exaggeration, that Ireland is the only nation in the world that was converted to Christianity without any bloodshed. There are no martyrs. They have no martyrology in Ireland. There's no list of martyrs. But they've made a practice of killing one another, haven't they? They've made a mockery of their faith, the faith professed by both Catholics and Protestants. So this is a shame. And for that reason, if no other, it would be helpful for all of us to go back to origins. Go back, this start? Where did all this come from to begin with? Well, from the 5th century, the arrival of St. Patrick, up to the 16th century, there was no division. All Ireland was united in faith, in doctrine, in practice. And then things began to happen. First of all, on the continent, there was a great Reformation within the Christian church. Now, that happened on the continent. It didn't happen in Ireland. But Ireland was affected by it, and badly affected by something that they had nothing to do with in a certain sense. They didn't create it. They didn't really participate in it. But because they were invaded by people of different religious persuasion, and the other beliefs were forced upon them and infiltrated their nation, there was division and there was fighting as a result. So it was the foreign invaders and a foreign reformation in religion that caused so much of the problems, so many of the problems that we know about even to this day. The secular history was changed, not just church history. The way the people of Ireland perceived themselves and the way they lived, their whole culture was affected by these events off the island, because they eventually infiltrated the island as well. The Romanization of the Irish Church further affected negatively the Celticism of the people. They became more Romanized and less Celtic in their Christianity. Now, there's a distinction to be made. To say that they were Celtic Christians and Roman Christians doesn't mean that essentially that they differed in essentials, but they certainly did differ in origins and in practice, and their culture was different, and the way they realized their religion in daily life was different in the Celtic lands than it was in those lands that had been invaded by the Roman armies and were influenced by Caesar and the Mediterranean culture. So the Irish were distinct but not separate. The Irish Christians were not Roman because, or let's put it this way, the distinction is not a separation. They still acknowledged that the Bishop of Rome was the head of the church, right? That was not a problem for them. They followed many of the practices of the continent and the regulations, but then besides that they had their own, so that they didn't share with the continental church the date of the celebration of Easter, for example. There was a great fuss over it. To us it seems like, what difference, whether you pick the first Sunday or the third Sunday, or no Sunday at all. for your Easter. But it was an issue at that time. Another issue that they disagreed with, that there was a difference of opinion on, was what they call the clerical tonsure, in which the ordained clergy had their hair shaved, shaved in a certain way, and the Irish had a different way of doing it. I personally think they were pretty ugly, but nevertheless, aside from personal taste in the matter, they thought it should be done a different way. They shaved onto the head off. Those of us who are trying to get hair to grow back on the front know that there's a disadvantage to that kind of tonsure. Anyhow, there were these little issues, but there were bigger issues as well. The ancient Celtic way of life became isolated into the most western island of Europe because the Celts were defeated all the way up north from Rome all the way up and into the British Isles and pushed out, except for little pockets here and there. In Gaul, there was a pocket where the Celts managed to hang on. In England, in Cornwall, there was a community there. Wales remained Celtic, but generally they were pushed out of England northward, see, up into what is now Scotland. And so the Celtic culture of the British Isles was more northerly Scottish and westerly Wales. Ireland was not touched, so they remained what they had been, and they were Celtic. But the Celticism, you have to ask the question we always do, who were they? And this is a standard definition. The Celts were a group of related tribes, not nations, tribes, linked by language, religion, and culture. They formed the first civilization north of the Alps. They emerged about the 8th century before Christ, about the time Homer was writing the Iliad in Greece, and Romulus and Remus were founding the city of Rome. So they go way back, 8 centuries before Christ. But they are not a nation. You see, they are a people. They spoke the same language. They had the same gods and goddesses. They had basically the same religious practices. And so, when Christianity came, and one of their own, a Celtic Briton named Patrick, came to Ireland and converted the nation. How did he do it? How could that have happened? How could a whole nation be converted so quickly and so thoroughly as Ireland was? Well, if you understood the Celtic culture, you would understand how they could make this change, this transition from paganism to Christianity overnight, virtually overnight, and without bloodshed. So we want to look at, this evening, just look at some of the characteristics of that way of life. On the one hand, the Irish people, we'll call them Irish people, though there wasn't an Ireland then, the people on that island, were known for their gentleness and their kindness to one another. Their organizations seemed to be motivated by good intentions and charity. But these good qualities that just about everybody at the time recognized were counterbalanced by a fierceness in war. And it's not only that they were fierce, but they loved to be fierce. They loved to fight. And they fought among themselves, the same people whom they loved. They fought with, you know, and they were forever squabbling because each tribe, each community, each family had its own king. And that's why at any one time there might have been 200 kings. That's why everybody in this room who said, I'm descendant of a king, I'm not saying you probably are. You know, so am I. You know, so we're even, we're equal. There were so many kings, but then there were provincial kings over larger territories, and the smaller kings owed tribute to them. And then there was the High King, Ardri, the High King, who presided over all the kings. Well, so far so good, but the difference in Ireland and other places where they have royal families is that the kingship is not hereditary. And if the king died, you had a fight to see who was going to be the next king. Or you might have, but it didn't necessarily pass on from father to son. But there was always somebody in charge at the head of it. Another characteristic of these people was that their women were treated with greater respect than they were in other places at that time and than they had been since that time. There was a good deal of equality or at least equity between men and women in the Celtic society. And this was reflected in the church too, with the abbesses. You not only had abbots running the monasteries, but you had abbesses running monasteries too, and great leaders and saints among them. So the place of women in Celtic society was probably better, more respected and honored than in the non-Celtic society. The tribe, I say, was the basic social unit, and if, as happens so often with St. Patrick, if he went in and found the king and converted the king, then all the rest of the lads joined in, and they just lined up for their baptism, you know. And so it was comparatively easy in that kind of society to get the head of the family follows, and Patrick evidently did that. But Father Joyce puts it this way: the tribe or clan was the principal social unit of Celtic society. One's identity came from belonging to this tribe, and loyalty to it was paramount. Many tribes together formed what they called a people, and each group had its own king. There were provincial kings and a high king. This was not a hereditary position. The king was chosen by the clan under the direction of the Druids. So we have to deal with the Druids, Druids, the Druids. The king had to embody what was the finest in the clan and had to be whole physically. He had to, if the king were injured in battle, lost an eye, for example, he would no longer be king because he was physically imperfect. See, so that was a requirement, a traditional requirement among the Celts. The king occupied a place not so much above the people as at their center. You see how they carry this over into religion soon. Not so much in a hierarchical position as in a unifying one. The king might share his quarters and sleep with the whole group of the clan. The image of kingship strikes me as an example. Strikes me as an example of intimate relationship, even in an authority figure. It helps me to see how fealty was easily transferred to Christ, and to understand the intimate relationship that was felt by him as a king. So this way of life, this culture, contributed to the forming these people for the coming of the grace of the church. By nature, they were prepared for the message of the Gospels. By nature, by culture, by their civilization, though they didn't know it, they were actually preparing themselves for the role of Christian in the world. The Druids, I mentioned them already, let's deal with them. They were not priests, as we understand the term. They were more like philosophers or theologians, scientists. They were social leaders. They had some political influence, and were the interpreters of the law. So the Druids were very important people, and they served in a way that seems to be similar to clerical organization in the church, but it wasn't quite that. The respect that was paid to them, to the Druids, was indeed transferred to the clergy, but the role played by the Druids was not the same as the role played by the clergy, or at least it wasn't supposed to be the same. Another aspect of their culture was that they had a love for land. They still do. I don't know how many of you here are landowners or farmers. Without speaking about anyone in a personal way, we can say generally the Irish people have been very conscious of land and owning land and protecting that land and fighting for that land. And so they have to establish borders and tree lines and all this, just to keep peace with their neighbors. And they often don't succeed in that. They'll quarrel over a bit of a corner of a field. They've been enculturated that way. And they think this is my land, you know. But it goes all the way back to the people living on that island before it was Ireland. They already were land conscious and land protective. Why? Well, land is the source of life. We can't live without land. Take away the land and we all die. So we have to have land. So it's the most important element for survival. You have to, well, not the only one, but it's among the top four. So land is necessary. Ownership was not only important for your own livelihood, but for your status in the community. And so if you owned land, good land, and kept it up well and so on, you were highly regarded in the community. And that's, I guess, one of the satisfactions that people all over may get. The poets called the natural world the gateway to the supernatural, the natural world. And so they looked upon the world, the ground we walk on, the air we breathe, the tree we sit under, the flowers we smell, the fish we catch, everything like that, every blessed thing, and they meant it that way, every blessed thing was blessed, was sacred, and it reflected the Creator, and therefore it should be respected. Boy, do we ever need Celticism today for that. To preserve the world, the earth, the environment. They believed in it, but they attached to it a spiritual meaning, not just a monetary one. It wasn't just because you get more money and you didn't have money. The boundary between the physical and the spiritual was hardly noticeable. The spiritual world was everywhere. God was everywhere in all things. And so they showed respect for every living being. This was the culture, the way they were brought up. In some places came to be thought of as being especially sacred, not just in general being sacred, but particular places like certain wells were thought to be holy wells, and if you drank the water, that would not only satisfy your thirst, but your soul as well. They said so, and they designated them. They called them that. This is before Christianity. They had such designations, and certain conformations of the land. They said were reminders of God, and so mountains. They had a great admiration for mountains. They had a great fear on the one hand, and love for the sea, the waters around Ireland. All of these things had a religious significance. If there's a hymn that is sung in many Catholic churches today attributed to St. Patrick. If you read it, instead of singing it, just look at the words and you see all these references to these physical, material things as paying honor to God. Well, the Celts understood that. Islands. They loved islands, small or large, and they must have had a lot of fun. I don't know if anyone ever counted, but they say there are 365 small islands around Ireland, outside the main island itself. That's pretty good. It's better not to count them, just accept the poetry of it, But all year we're surrounded by these holy places, but they designated them, and then in the Christian era, they became associated with saintly people, people who went to those islands to do penance, to pray, to seek solitude, spiritual growth, and so we have so many of these islands. Iona, for example, in Scotland, is such a place. Iona, a sacred island, made sacred by the Irish missionary Columbus and Columba, and his followers. But everybody there's certainly more tradition going back to the Druids, so that even to this day, people, especially on Halloween, go to the woods and do funny things, and they don't realize that this is a tradition that goes back to pre-Christian times in Ireland. And so we'll be celebrating Halloween, the evening of All Hallows, All Saints. In Ireland, they don't use the word saint, they say hallows. So All Hallows Eve. And so many of the traditions that are now very playful and a lot of fun for adults as well as kids, originated in some of these rituals and ceremonies in the pre-Christian and early Christian times. There are certain locations, too, like Kildare, has religious connotations. That's just, there's so many of them. Tara is another, the High King resided in Tara. In England, Glastonbury may be the most famous. It's certainly very well known and respected by non-Christians, Christians, and pagans, and so on. So many traditions connected with Glastonbury, including the Catholic Benedictine monastery that's there. Perhaps the least known, but should be well known, is the Boyne, the river Boyne, because we think of it as the place where William defeated James, or chased him out. Yes, but long before that, the Boyne was honored by the people, named for a goddess, named wine, B-O-I-N-E. And the people regarded that water as having very special, important properties. It still does, but as you know, in a different historical context. Not only do they respect places, they even named their children after places. I notice that this is a practice nowadays. It seems a little bizarre to do that unless you had some good cultural reason for doing it. So to name a child after a state in the United States, a tribe of Indians or something, if you're not Indian, if you're not from the state, it seems not like that. It doesn't seem like a good cultural sign. It suggests that it doesn't seem to matter what name you put on it. And so the children were often named after places or the people who made those places famous. And so in Irish families, but not only, in Celtic families, let's say in general, you often find the same name carried on from generation to generation to generation, and sometimes they skip, and it's every second generation you see the name repeated, because the tendency was to name the first son after his grandfather. So, the paternal grandfather. That was the way it was done. And so the names continued right down for centuries, and that's how often that people were able to identify themselves. So you would get names like Kevin and Dermot, Laura, Maeve, and so on. You get all these saints' names passed on from generation to generation, but prior to the Christian names, the pagans did the same thing. Another characteristic of the time was that these early Christians, like their predecessors, often like to get away from it all and go to the desert. And so you see in Irish place names Dysart, D-Y-S-A-R-T, or D-I-S-E-R-T. And it doesn't really mean a desert, meaning a sandy place with no trees. It means a hermitage. And those people, at least occasionally, like to get away, to go to the mountains, to go live in caves, to go to remote places, to go to the islands off the coast, to get away from, and meditate, gather themselves together, get to know themselves as well as the world around them. So islands became important for them as places of refuge from the pressures of society. It won't surprise anyone here to know that the Irish had a reputation for being intensely verbal. That is, they talked a lot. Irish people generally like to talk. Generally, not everybody. We have silent people among us, and we wonder what's wrong with them. But they like to talk. They're sociable, gregarious people. Generally speaking, you think about it if you never thought about it before. you are the way you are because it's part of your inheritance. You didn't decide in grade 6, I'm going to be talkative the rest of my life. No, it wasn't a conscious decision, but that's the way you were brought up. And so you pass that on. Oral culture is so important to the Celtic people. What they say, see, for centuries, they communicated just by talking. They didn't write. They had no books. The word was passed on by word of mouth. This is how their traditions were. And so the bards of Ireland had to memorize thousands of lines of verse and pass it on, and it took 18 to 20 years to get establish your status as a bard, because you had to memorize. And the way they did it, they would lie down and close their eyes and say out loud. They understood what educators make a big fuss over today, so something brand new. They say, everything we know has come to us through our senses. And so, if you want to know a thing in an oral culture, you have to speak it, you use your voice, and you have to hear it. Because you can't see it, it's not written, you have to hear it and speak it. And so the Celts developed an oral culture. And this was true of where they passed on their language, the Celtic or Gaelic language. It was by voice. They did the same, of course, for their music. And their stories, they passed them on just by telling them to one another. So they came to be known as people of the word. Isn't that wonderful? And if you capitalize word, it's even more of a compliment, because the same techniques, the same practice of memorizing the words becomes the method of spreading the word, the gospel. And so, tell an Irishman and the word will be spread, and how it gets around. They don't keep a heck of a lot to themselves. Not only were they good talkers, but they applied their artistic skills in very remarkable ways. I'm talking about these early Christians and pre-Christians. And I'm going to be showing some slides very shortly. And you'll see instances of the workmanship of these early Christians in the illuminated manuscripts and in the high crosses and other sculpture work of the early Middle Ages. I think it's still true for most of us, but even if it isn't, it was indeed true in the past, that the Celts loved heroes. They loved their heroes. They admired them. There's so much of that hero worship in our society. I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying there's a great deal of it. Like hockey players or football, baseball players, they're great heroes. We understand that, we accept it. Well, they had their heroes. Usually they were warriors. So if you wanted to be a hero in those days, your achievements in battle, in fighting, would bring you to the attention of the masses. They loved their heroes. and then Patrick introduced them to the supreme hero. Okay, guys, there's the new hero, and so they became followers of Christ. See, originally they were disposed. That's what I was trying to find earlier. They were disposed by upbringing, by tradition, by their culture, disposed to accept Christianity. They did something else. Some of you may be surprised to know that they made saints of their heroes, even if they weren't very saintly. But they did. If you wonder, as Jimmy does, how come there's so many Irish saints? Well, there aren't. Maybe they are, but they're not canonized. They don't have very many canonized saints in Ireland. But they have lots of these traditional saints, people, and they didn't always call them saints for their virtue, but for their achievements. They could be called, but I don't mean that made saints, but nobody's a saint until you get to heaven. So they weren't saints in the way that people mean the word today, the specialized saints, but they were people that were looked up to and admired. It's no accident, really, just think about it, that one of the great favorites of the Celtic people, and it doesn't matter whether you're in Gaul or in Cornwall or in Scotland or in Ireland, one of the great heroes is the Archangel Michael. Defend us in the day of battle. We used to pray to St. Michael. And that's what he was. He was the warrior angel, And so they idolized him and built this great shrine on the Skelligs off the coast of Kerry to St. Michael. Well, that's all right. They were being consistent. They had a respect for the Druids, for the bards, the poets, the people of letters. The Druids had, and so did the early Christians. And that's one of the reasons that they honored the monks. And it was one of the ways that the monks honored them by pursuing the arts through using their talents in the monasteries to recreate the books of the Gospels and other holy books that all had to be done by hand. But just because they were copying didn't mean they would be sloppy about it. They wanted to make it as beautiful as possible. And so we'll see some examples of that in a few minutes on the screen. Perhaps the underlying characteristic of the people, which turns out to be so important, is the love for creation, for all nature. Another was that they liked to roam, to wander. They became great pilgrims. They go all over the world. 70 million of us scattered around the globe. Don't we ever stay at home? The Irish were always travelers. They still are, their descendants are. They're on the move. It is part of their tradition. They were explorers, and fearless explorers. One of the talks that will be given in this series has to do with some of the discoveries of early America by the Irish navigators. Dr. O'Hare will be talking about that. So these are the people, after that preparation, very quickly, easily, thoroughly accepted Christianity. And that Christianity grew among them in the time of Patrick up to the Reformation. It grew naturally, peacefully, uniquely, because they were so far removed from the continent, they didn't have very much contact with Rome or with the church on the continent. So in many ways they developed independently, and they pursued their own interests, and it was easy for them, because they believed in the sacredness of creation, to accept the meaning of bread, of wine, of oil, of water. No problem, they said. For them, because he had already been disposed to like these things, to acknowledge them as being special gifts. They also spoke in triads, in threes. And so when Patrick came and told them about the Trinity, in effect, he said, what's new? They were already thinking in terms of threes. And maybe the best example is well, we said Saint Bridget, but Saint Bridget was originally a pagan goddess, right? The original Bridget. But she was a goddess of three different areas, so she was a kind of trinity to the Celtic people. It wasn't, maybe Patrick did indeed show them a shamrock, and they said, that proves it, that settles it. Let's go on from there. Maybe. You know, it's a good story whether it happened that way or not. But the point is that the doctrine of the Trinity was not an obstacle to the Celtic people. It was in other parts of the world, and still is for many people in various places, but not for the Celts. They accepted the Trinity. They also accepted abstract images. They liked abstraction. They liked puzzles. They liked mysteries. And so when they were told about the mysteries of Christianity, that was part of their. They didn't believe those specific ones prior to Christianity, but they were used to dealing with mysteries. The result of this was that Irish Catholicism, I'm going to say now, especially Catholicism, Irish Christianity, absorbed a great deal of paganism. That means we had a lot of superstitions coming with the real thing. And some of them still exist. Some of them persist. Not that they have been approved, I don't mean that, but many people, Irish people, undereducated people, still will recite some of the superstitions that came from centuries ago. Now, why would Ireland develop differently from the continent? This is going to be a simplification, but I think it works. Ireland was a rural nation. There were no cities until the Vikings came and started establishing. The Irish did not build Dublin. They didn't build Wexford. They didn't build Galway. But no, these were instituted by the Scandinavians. And so their church, the way the church was organized in Ireland, was different from the way it was organized in the continent of Europe. On the continent, bishops resided in major cities, and that was their see. You know, when they named the diocese after the city, like the Bishop of Charlottetown, as though it was just this little town, the city of this territory, and so on. But in Ireland they didn't have cities, so how could you be a bishop if you didn't have a city? Well, they didn't need them. They didn't need cities. They didn't have cities, and they had a different structure. They had these small communities. Theirs was a communal church, of small communities and little monasteries, hundreds of monasteries. Can you imagine? Now, I think we have one. I do even have one left on the island. But we used to, I guess we still have the monastery of the Precious Blood. But there are a few monasteries in the maritime area. But could you imagine being in a place the size of New Brunswick and have 200 monasteries? That's the way it was in Ireland. Okay? So their church was organized around these small communities. And there were bishops, all right, but they were part of the monastery. They would preside over the sacraments reserved for the bishops. The priests in the monastery would conduct the liturgical services, yes, but they didn't have, even the abbot, he was an administrator of the monastery, like a mayor or something like that, but he wasn't, he didn't have supreme control. He did manage the affairs, right? So there was a division of labor, and complete the picture. If you didn't have an abbot, you might have an abbess, a woman who would be the boss. And this was often the case. Or they had a division within the monastic community of men and women. And the abbess was the supreme one in her division. So they developed ways of doing things, of conducting their church and their church services different from what was going on the continent. And when I show you the pictures and show you what the monasteries look like, it might surprise you to find that the church, the oratory, usually was very small, and sometimes these monasteries would have as many as 1,200, 2,000 people, and the church would be half the size of this room. how do you explain it? How is it? Well, you did the natural thing. You did what the council always did. You knelt on the ground and you said your prayers out in the open where God could see you, and where you could see God. You know, it was, they loved the world around them. There was no need to build a huge cathedral as the house of God, when all you have to do is open your eyes. So we look around any place in County Kerry. This is heaven. You know, this is God is here. And so they prayed, and they prayed together, but not necessarily in a church building. Later on, when the continental Christians came, the Normans particularly, came into Ireland, they put up those big places. Those huge monasteries, and cathedrals that we still see, at least we see the ruins of them in many places in Ireland. But they weren't the original Celtic construction. Okay? The Roman model of Christianity was not the one enforced in Ireland until the Reformation, and then it was necessary, or deemed necessary, to tighten the screws on these people, and the Counter-Reformation that took place in the continent of Europe was applied to Ireland as well. And the Irish took it up with greater vigor than they did many other places, and so they became more puritanical than the Puritans. They became more severe often than, well, certainly than they had been. And so gradually, even perceptibly, the Celtic church receded, and the Romanized version succeeded, took its place, and called upon the loyalty of the people and got it. But that whole cultural preparation that existed for 1,000 years was denatured. There wasn't much of it left. Now, when we look around us today, many people are searching for spiritual security, fulfillment, not just in an individual way, but for the sake of the world in which we live, for the sake of humanity. And some are saying, let's look back to our roots. And what we have neglected, there was no need to throw away everything. No need to make such sweeping changes that we rejected our past entirely, that we lost contact with the traditions that had a vitality, a vibrancy that could be very, very useful, helpful in the world today. And so some people are looking back to an earlier age, not to go back, no, that's not the idea, but to bring forward the goodness of those earlier ages and apply it to our world. And so there is a good reason to be interested in Celtic Christianity, not just as an academic study, but as a contribution to Christianity in our time. Well, I don't know, George, if you want to a recess, but I have a series of slides that I've taken in Ireland that deal with all of these things, and I'll be very happy to show them. But if you want to recess first, okay.
Yeah, I think maybe we should take a break.
Okay, fine.
Maybe normally we serve lunch and tea and coffee at the end of the lecture, but I think what we do, you've been sitting for quite a while now, maybe we'll take a 10-minute break. There's sandwiches and cookies and coffee and tea at the back. So those of you who can stay with us, grab a coffee, tea, sandwich, come back to your seats, and Doctor will take us through the slide part of the presentation. While I have the mic, I want to apologize for the distraction from downstairs earlier in the evening. We went out downstairs to the Kinsman Club, and usually we try to coordinate our activities so that one doesn't interfere with the other. We didn't succeed tonight, but I can promise you we'll succeed in the following Friday nights. We won't have that distraction, so my apologies for that. And let's take a 10-minute break and grab something to eat and come back, stretch your legs, and we'll Folks, if you're all supplied, we'll ask you to return to your seats and we'll get on with the slideshow. While we're waiting, perhaps I should mention a word on next week's lecture. Dr. Padraig O'Shea is coming back over from St. Mary's. He's holder of the Chair of Irish Studies at St. Mary's University in Halifax. And a lot of you have seen Dr. O'Shea before, I know of him, but for any new people, again, he's quite an interesting individual. He's from the old country. He's a fluent Irish speaker, and he writes and publishes in both Irish and English. Very dynamic individual. And the lecture next week is going to be deal with J.M. Sims' play, The Playboy of the Western World. Unbeknownst to me, and I guess unbeknownst to a lot of us, when The Playboy of the Western World, which is a very well-known play, was first put on in Dublin, it created riots, because Sim in his play portrayed the Irish and the rural community in real life in not very favorable terms. And the Irish don't like to be told about the bad things in their society, because they don't think there is anything bad in their society, anything is memorable. So the lecture next week will be, Dr. O'Shea will be talking about the play and its presentation at the Abbey Theatre in 1907, the riots that ensued, and all the gory details and funny anecdotes that go along with it. So make a note of that, and if you can join us next Friday, please do. I'll turn this back over to Dr. Brady.
Most of you recognize the gentleman on the screen, Patrick. The statue, though, would interest you. It comes from it's the masthead of a ship, and went down someplace off Nova Scotia. And this picture taken at the Nova Scotia Museum of Patrick. Okay, good. I think we have to turn off the lights. They say the Irish work better in the dark, so we'll see. Am I in somebody's way here?